Go for it.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to give everyone just a few more seconds to join before we get started. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Marissa Adams, and I am the marketing manager here at Trace Security. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll answer as many as we can at the end during Q&A. We will be sending out the slides and recordings to all the attendees next week. And to get us started, I wanted to introduce Trace Security and give some background on our expertise in information security. With 19 years in business, Trace Security is a leading provider of cybersecurity and compliance solutions. Our company was founded on February 18th, 2004 to help banks and credit unions protect their customer and member information and comply with GLBA, FFIEC, and NCUA requirements. Since then, Trace Security has served over 3,000 organizations across the United States, and we have established many partnerships, most notably our strategic alliance with CUNA, the Credit Union National Association, who positions us as their exclusive provider for cybersecurity and compliance services. Trace Security offers a comprehensive suite of solutions that allow organizations to manage their information security program, including IT risk assessments and audits, social engineering, penetration testing, security training, and more. At this time, I'd like to turn things over to David Kovich, one of our senior information security analysts, who's going to tell you all some more about tabletop testing.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Kovich. I'm one of the Trace Security information security analysts here. I've been in this field for almost 10 years now, performing various services, including penetration tests, risk assessments, IT security audits, and tabletop testing. During my time with Trace Security, I performed many tabletop exercises for an array of various size organizations that have used our tabletop testing services for compliance, incident response preparedness, and training. Today, I hope to share some of those experiences with you all in hopes of showing all of our attendees that there is no wrong time to start tabletop testing with us. So let's start with an overview of what we'll be talking about. We'll be discussing what tabletop testing is, including the setup, expectations, guidelines, and finally the benefits of performing this type of testing. So what is a tabletop test? A tabletop test is a discussion-based disaster preparedness exercise that takes participants through the process of dealing with a simulated disaster or incident scenario in a risk-free environment. It involves coordinated discussion with team members, typically led by a facilitator who guides the discussion and asks pointed questions. The exercise can help organizations to assess, practice, and improve performance in the prevention, protection, response, and recovery capabilities, all as part of the risk management process. The results from the exercise can help an organization identify any gaps or deficiencies in the recovery documentation and training. Tabletop testing is typically performed against an organization's incident response plan, disaster recovery plan, and business continuity plan. Depending on the size of the organization, these plans could all be separate plans or rolled into a single response and recovery plan. So next, let's talk about the typical participants and responsibilities that are a part of this tabletop exercise. Firstly, the players. These are the key stakeholders who will have an active role in discussing or performing their regular roles and responsibilities during the particular scenario. Next, the observers. They don't really directly participate in the exercise. However, they might support the development of player responses to the situation during the discussion by asking relevant questions or providing subject matter expertise. And lastly, the facilitator. The facilitator leads the exercise scenario, providing situational updates, asking pointed questions, and moderating the discussion. Optionally, you can also assign note takers. Their only role is to simply observe and document the discussion, specifically outlining any gaps or deficiencies identified for later discussion. Next, we're going to cover general guidelines for a tabletop test. These types of exercises should be held in an open, no-fault environment. You want to create an environment where your participants feel safe to express varying viewpoints and respond to the scenarios using their knowledge of existing plans, capabilities, and insights derived from their training and experience. These exercises are an opportunity to discuss and present multiple options and possible solutions and to best resolve or mitigate potential problems. So there are two types of scenarios or general outlines for them, natural disasters and internal incidents. Typical natural disaster scenarios can include floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, pandemics, while internal incident scenarios can include ransomware, malicious insider, supply chain attacks, phishing responses, those types of things. So how do you go about planning a tabletop test? I would say the biggest hurdle when planning a tabletop test is the scheduling and coordinating of it. Typical scenario, our exercise in general, might last about 3 to 4 hours or more, depending on various circumstances, and require key stakeholders in your organization. Key stakeholders typically include anyone directly involved with handling a potential disaster or incident for that particular scenario. This can include relevant third parties as well. Bringing these people together for even a few hours can be the biggest challenge, as these people typically have pretty busy schedules. These exercises are best done via in-person roundtable discussion, but can be performed remotely if need be. Once the engagement has been scheduled and coordinated, you might want to choose what kind of scenario you want to run and test your recovery documentation against. Choosing a natural disaster type scenario comes down to mostly location. Here in Louisiana, we don't have earthquakes, but we do have regular hurricanes. As for choosing an internal incident type scenario, we recommend choosing a scenario that the organization has documented recovery procedures for. This way, those procedures can be directly put to the test, and any deficiencies in those procedures can be identified. Once a scenario has been selected, you should probably set the objectives for that particular scenario. For example, in the event of a natural disaster, your objectives might be to ensure the safety and security of employees, to continue business operations where feasible, and recover normal business operations after the event is over. To get the best results out of an exercise like this, you should make sure that the participants of the scenario are prepared in advance of the engagement. They should understand their particular role and what to expect out of the engagement. Emphasize the purpose of the exercise, the particular objectives of the scenario, and the overall guidelines. You want to make the most out of the short time you have together. Now we're going to run through a little bit of an example of a tabletop scenario. We've already set some objectives for the natural disaster scenario earlier in the presentation. So let's continue from that and review a scenario for a client I recently facilitated a tabletop exercise for. The natural disaster they chose was a blizzard. Before we jumped into the scenario, I asked how the organization had prepared and planned against a potential blizzard disaster. And that helped me kind of better phrase my questions as a facilitator and helped kind of open up the discussion among the participants. And then after that, we kind of reviewed the guidelines and the overall objectives, and then we dove right into the scenario. As the facilitator of the exercise, I read out the introduction to the scenario, as you can see here, Sunday, 5 p.m. The National Weather Service, NWS, detects a cold front moving towards your city. Weather officials urge citizens to prepare for a large storm that will likely begin in the next 24 hours. A winter storm warning is issued by the NWS, including your city as well as surrounding areas within 100 miles. The NWS predicts light snow that will likely mix with or change into sleet or freezing rain with significant icing possibility by tomorrow afternoon. Ice accumulation will likely be between 1/2 to 1 inch, with highest icing potential near downtown city. The public is advised to expect widespread power outages, damaged trees, and treacherous road conditions because of the ice storm. That's just a nice introduction to the scenario. And you'll see here that the scenario starts on a specific day. And as that scenario progresses, time will progress at a faster rate as the organization begins responding and going through their defined procedures. It continues with the facilitator injecting what we have multiple ejections throughout the week, and as the blizzard progresses, and eventually the organization loses the ability to perform business operations. Eventually, the blizzard dissipates, and the organization is using the recovery documentation. They ran through their procedures for assessing physical damage to their branches, and then they began getting business operations back up efficiently. Throughout this scenario, we identified multiple gaps and deficiencies in the recovery documentation for the things that the organization had not considered before. We noted them down, but we continued with the scenario. And only after the scenario was completed did we specifically discuss those gaps and deficiencies that we identified. And once that scenario was completed, we moved on to the last portion, which is the lesson learned portion. This is also an open discussion with all participants. The group can discuss any gaps and deficiencies that were identified, as well as ask overarching questions. Some questions that I like to ask in reflection: what went well during that scenario? What didn't go well? Were the defined objectives met? What gaps, deficiencies were identified in the recovery documentation? Were there any situations or contingencies that the organization had not considered? How did the recovery teams operate during this exercise? These questions can help facilitate healthy, open discussion within the organization. From there, the organization can use that knowledge and lessons learned to make improvements to recovery procedures and training. For the blizzard engagement I mentioned earlier, the organization and I identified that their communication procedures inside their BCP were not robust enough to handle the disaster efficiently. Additionally, while they had implemented relationships to set up off-site temporary branches in the event their physical locations sustained damage, those procedures were not fully formalized or tested yet. This opened us up to walking through that process. How would they obtain simple supplies like chairs and tables for this temporary branch? Who would transport all those supplies, including the workstations, etc.? More on that as we dove into that process. And these are just a few examples of the lessons learned that can come out of this exercise. While tabletop exercises can be performed purely internally, for the most effective results, it is recommended to use an experienced third party to provide an objective outside view of your recovery process. They can also provide professional recommendations and insight that might not be considered by internal employees. And with that, we'll run through some of the new compliance standards and best practices. NIST Special Publication 800-84 provides guidance for tabletop testing for organizations of all sizes and types. While no specific timeline is required, NIST states that organizations should conduct tabletop exercises periodically. The need could be triggered by things like organizational changes, updates to an IT plan, or the issuing of new regulatory guidance. NIST SP 800-84 Section 4 provides details on designing, developing, conducting, and evaluating a tabletop exercise. This is a very good resource. Tabletop exercises are now specifically required for credit unions, though, under the NCUA's New Information Examination ISE program requirements that began at the beginning of this year. The new program is tiered by asset size. Credit unions below 50 million in assets fall under the Small Credit Union Examination Program, and those above 50 million in assets fall under the Core and Core Plus program. Tabletop testing is required for both of these programs. In conclusion here, tabletop exercises are an excellent way to help train employees and test response plans in an open discussion format. Utilizing these lessons learned from these exercises can help the organization prepare for the worst and hopefully lessen the potential impact a disaster can have on your business operations.
All right, we are going to start taking questions here, so feel free to drop those in the Q&A. Just to reiterate, we will be sending out a copy of the slides and the recording early next week to everyone that registered and attended today. So one of the questions is, how long does a tabletop test usually take? Like, how long should they plan for?
It definitely varies. There are a lot of variables here, but I would say typically about 3 or 4 hours. But like I said, that definitely depends on organizational size, the number of scenarios you're looking to perform, the topics being exercised, and overall the objectives that you're setting.
Okay, and should you invite your third-party providers to the tabletop, things like your MSP, 24/7 monitoring kind of vendors?
If they're part of your recovery process and documentation, I would definitely say it's beneficial to include them if possible. Again, scheduling and coordination definitely might be an issue here, but you can still get a lot of benefits without third parties if you're unable to coordinate with them.
Okay. And someone asked, which scenarios should we consider to meet the NCUA requirements?
I mean, there's a lot of options that you have out there. I think in general, you're wanting to look at one of each of the ones that I presented would be a natural disaster, but also an internal incident. I think one of each is kind of what you're looking for. And like I said, for natural disasters, it also going to depend on your location and obviously what potential natural disasters you could have. As for more internal incidents, there are always a lot of good ones out there to choose from between a malicious insider or a supply chain attack or ransomware, things of that nature.
Okay, and where do we find possible scenarios, or should we just make them up?
I would definitely do a little bit of research on it. I would recommend checking out the NIST guidance. There'll be a link in the PowerPoint that is sent out that links to a PDF from them, and it goes into a lot of detail in regards to how to formulate scenarios appropriately. I think it comes down to doing a lot of research and figuring out how the best way you want to test your organization and how far you're wanting to go.
Okay. And someone asked, how effective would a tabletop test be that's sent to different business units to complete on their own and then provide feedback to their risk team?
I think that works, but I think you're losing a lot of the benefits of the roundtable discussion of the tabletop engagement. So I don't necessarily wouldn't recommend that. Like I said, I think those benefits are what makes this exercise so important, is that in the event of a real disaster, you're all meeting like this and you're all working together towards a solution. So trying to emulate that as best as possible, a real disaster, I think should be your goal for this.
Okay. Someone asked how often you should do regular tabletop testing according to the new regulations, and I'm assuming that is related to the new NCUA regulations. From what we've read from the NCUA, they haven't defined a specific timeline for how often you should do it. It just says regularly. So at the end of the day, I think that really comes down to what your examiner is going to require. And unfortunately, we can't always tell you that. Okay. And who should the facilitator be if they don't use a third party to run the tabletop test?
Definitely no wrong answer there, but you want someone who is prepared in advance, and they've developed the scenario and are able to run that scenario to its fullest extent, I would say. They need to be able to ask pointed questions and facilitate those discussions. Like I said, I would definitely check out that NIST guidance that we're providing, or that they provide for further guidance on that, to how to create a scenario and how to run it.
All right, I'm going to give just a couple more seconds in case there are any more questions. All right, it looks like that is all we got for today. Obviously, if y'all think of any other questions that you have, you're free to email us or David directly. Our contact information is on the screen. And we really appreciate you all joining us today. I hope you learned some more about tabletop testing and what you need to do for your compliance this year.